Thank you for joining us, and for those who will be viewing this now, and also this event is being recorded, so it will be available on the website of the Institute. This is the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute Forum, and today's forum is about lessons from Kyrgyzstan's experiment with parliamentarism. Of course, we appreciate that at this time there are things happening in the world that may seem more urgent than a look at Kyrgyzstan's experience with parliamentarism. But nevertheless, we are committed to doing this event and to make it available for those of us who may not be available to see it right now or to join the discussion, but will be able to see it later. The paper that this forum is the subject of is by Dr. Johan Engvall, who has been a long-time fellow with the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and Silk Road Studies program. He published this paper just last month, which he, I think it's not the culmination, but it's definitely a partial result of his long engagement in Central Asian politics, and particularly with Kyrgyzstan, including a dissertation that focused on the Kyrgyzstan's politics as a form of an informal market. We are also equally happy to have with us Dr. Erika Marat of the National Defense University, who formerly was a member of our team at the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and Silk Road Studies program, first in Sweden and then in Washington, who is also not only from Kyrgyzstan, but has been working on affairs related to the functioning of the state and the political system in Kyrgyzstan, and obviously in the rest of Central Asia as well. Focusing particularly on the security sector of the state, I should say. The paper is not only an effort to look backwards, I would say, because obviously Kyrgyzstan moved into a parliamentary system of government, and now recently back to a presidential system of government. I think what this paper tries to do is to look at how this has evolved over time, but also what led to the, if you will, the different fluctuations of the choice of how to model a political system. There were reasons why Kyrgyzstan moved from a presidential to a parliamentary system of government after two regimes that had seen the accumulation of both economic and political power in very few hands, with the idea that a parliamentary system might be a solution to this problem the country was facing. The decision to go back again suggests that it may not have succeeded in resolving the problem. I will leave to Johan Engvall to discuss in detail his findings, but I should note that this is happening. We're launching this paper and having this webinar at a time when Kyrgyzstan is once again seeking to re-emerge in the consciousness of at least the American policymaking community and the Western one more generally, after a number of years of, should we say, moving to the outskirts of our consciousness, consciously, unconsciously. Kyrgyzstan, of course, was a country that was in many ways the favorite, so to speak, or the most well-traveled, the most well-known country, held up as a model in many ways. But Kyrgyzstan has faded from where the place in the discussion that it used to have regarding Central Asian politics. And it seems to me that there may be things happening that make it very relevant to once again look at Kyrgyzstan. So Johan, I'll leave the floor to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Svante. Really look forward to this. Yes, if I say a few words about how I was thinking about when I was writing this paper, it's of course this aspect that Kyrgyzstan's parliament, Jogorku Kenesh, of course, as you mentioned, it gained particular attention after 2010, you can say, when the country's leadership adopted this constitutional reform, which I would say meant a real step towards establishing a parliamentary form of government. And this parliamentary style system, it lasted for a decade, but since the country returned to a presidential form of government last year, so that is, you know, the more recent. But even before, I would say, this 2010 constitutional reform, Kyrgyzstan's parliament had been a much more dynamic, independent political institution than in most of these other post-Soviet countries, and especially then in Central Asia. So it has been much more than just this rubber stamping body that you often hear about. And so I would say that it has significantly formed Kyrgyzstan's political life and its development since the 1990s. So against this background, I would say that the purpose of the paper was to analyze how Kyrgyzstan's parliament has evolved over the past 30 years. So not just this so-called parliamentary decade. And since independence, of course, there have been quite many. I think with the recent one, it's now 8 different parliamentary convocations. And the last one then was elected late last year. So I go through these in the paper here, trying to map both continuities and changes here in how these various parliaments have functioned and behaved, you can say. So of course here I will not go into detail of these different parliaments. Instead I will try to give some general impressions as well as maybe try to raise a few, give a few key takeaways here that might help to understand why these promises of this parliamentary style system of the past decade, while that failed to truly materialize, I would say. But overall, I think you can say that the parliament's development here has really been a process of trial and error. It's been the search here for its rightful place, or how you want to call it, in Kyrgyzstan's political system here, has been at the center of a lot of political debate and numerous constitutional and electoral changes, and also these recurrent changes in these formal rules of the political system also have had an impact here on how they have really forced the political elites here in the parliament to adapt their behavior and to a very, dynamic or fluctuating environment, I would say. But then, despite these many changes in the parliament's form, its size, how it is elected, and also you have also had this introduction of special quotas and things like that. I would say that on a general level, and you can say that the profile of a typical member of parliament has become quite clear here. It's a 45 to 50-year-old Kyrgyz man, often with a strong provincial attachment, I would say, and a primary background in some kind of business activities. And more often than not, this typical MP often changed political parties or political affiliation. So that's can be flexibly adjusted to, I would say. But one notable thing I would say is that ever since this first, let's say, post-Soviet election there back in 1995, which was the first parliamentary election after independence, all these elections have been remarkably competitive, I have to say. That's clear. There's been a very high demand here among elites, old and new, to gain a parliamentary mandate. And you can say pretty much without exception, all these major political actors in the country have served in the parliament, including the many presidents that Kyrgyzstan has had. And I will also say that another thing is that while these elections, of course, have been competitive, it should be pointed out also that they have not been free and fair. That's clear. But there's been a lot of administrative resources used, and bribery, and different kinds of voting manipulation have been rather common. But there have also been significant improvements in this electoral process. which has made it much more difficult to engage in some of these malpractices. But it has also led actors to adapt to some extent, and you see the emergence of some more sophisticated type of manipulation and things like that. But anyways, stakes have been very high here, and it's been rather difficult, I would say, for the authorities here to really control these competitive processes inside the country. And when they have tried, people have in general reacted to it and protested against it. So it should of course be remembered then that the parliament has been at the center here of no less than 3 major political upheavals or revolutions here. You had in 2005 and 2020 as protests here against rigged elections, and also you can say in 2010 when Bakiyev's administration was removed, the parliament at that time, which was seen quite to a large extent actually as a illegitimate extension of that regime, that parliament was instantly dissolved, for instance. So this competitiveness is an important factor, I think, and that leads to another thing that's been part of this competitiveness also, and that's the role of political parties here, which has been an interesting aspect, if imperfect, I would say, of Kyrgyzstan's political system. There have been many political parties, and new ones continue to emerge all the time, basically, especially ahead of elections. And a striking feature also for Kyrgyzstan has been the inability here of the presidents to create these viable ruling parties. And even if they have tried to do so, these parties have had very short lasting power, you can say. And then, of course, when it comes to political parties, they became especially important after the 2010 constitutional reform, which meant that those parties that were elected to parliament, they had the power to form governments, make important appointments, and then other things. So as a result of this, I would say that the fate of the type of parliamentarism that was introduced in 2010 depended a lot here on the ability of political leaders here to build strong parties. And the idea, I think, was good at the time. I at least thought so, that it was necessary to because I remember back in 2000, between 2005 and 2007, and at that period when you had this parties played basically no role, you had this single mandate districts, and I really thought back then that the solution here would be to build up the party system. But then if we see how it developed, if we look behind this surface here of these many parties, it is clear that the party system here remains extremely fragmented and weakly institutionalized. And you can say that in reality here, the parties here, they primarily serve as impermanent here, quite flexible vehicles here for narrow elite interests. It's a kind of a brand here that elites use rather than channels for political representation. And also their ideological platforms never really developed in terms of concrete policy programs. I would say that there's been more and more focus, or parties pay attention to positioning themselves, especially emphasizing values and often related to cultural and nationalistic aspects of the Kyrgyz nation and these things. But these more concrete policies have not really developed, or ideological differences. So you can say that the party factions also, you could see in the parliament during this parliamentary system, they were very much characterized by internal rebellions, formal splits. Many MPs, they changed the party affiliations, or they created new parties. Some of these new parties, they are often set up essentially to serve what is the dominant political elite interest here at the time. But when presidents change or there are some other major political changes, they often disappear extremely quickly. They just vanish. So to understand the failure of the parliamentary system of this past decade, I think the lack of real political party development was a major factor here behind the parliament's inability here to govern more effectively. And this, how to say, fluid party system with weak accountability mechanisms also that failed to give the parliament here, the parliamentary system, real meaning here for citizens. And I think that also helps a bit to explain or understand here why a presidential system quite often also may appeal here among people as a more straightforward, more effective decision-making system here to people in Kyrgyzstan. One other aspect here with the parliament in general and also related to the parties here is this that I have focused on earlier, also this type of powerful market logic that's shaped here this political institution and the parties also. This fact that financial muscles have been key to securing access to the parliament. And under this proportional representation here based on these party lists, it was often common here that the parties here, Kyrgyz media have reported a lot about this, and even politicians themselves have speak openly about this. This is very much in the open. This is about putting a price on their slots here on the party list, and then turning in a way these parliamentary mandates into subjects of an internal market, you can say. So when candidates then enter the parliament after having made these large, often financial contribution, could be several hundred thousands of dollars, they of course had strong incentives here to return these investments here, and as a result, of course, then the corruption, different type of corrupt deals, you could say, really flourished here. But I will also say that this business-like function of the parliament, my argument is that should also be seen in a larger perspective of Kyrgyzstan's business environment, which is characterized by very, very weak rule of law here. So in this type of formal legal vacuum, at least the formal legal vacuum here, the parliament also serves as a kind of extra legal institution here for business elites who of course have an interest in seeking to secure their properties and also use this to gain advantages here on the market. So I think you could talk in a sense here with this perspective that kind of if you remember this state capture approach from the World Bank, here you can talk about a kind of inverse state capture here, rather than these private actors buying special treatment from the state, but essentially from the outside. It has become more effective here to directly influence rent seeking and secure different type of privileges here from inside the state here as a parliamentarian. Because this 2010 constitution, since that constitution gave the parliament here greater powers, of course, this also gave further incentives to invest, I would say, in a parliamentary mandate. So as a consequence, I think this period, this parliamentary decade, we can say that a broad group of businessmen really dominated here, including oligarchs, there could be racketeers, bazaar owners, construction magnates, but also this type of civil servants that often had some concealed business interests or had been involved in corrupt dealings here. So these type of broad group, these broad groups, they really established an extremely strong grip here over the parliament. Of course, and that didn't have a positive effect on the supply here of nationwide legislation, and it also tended to become a problem here with mechanisms of accountability here to the electorate here, because this gap that really opened up with this type of say human composition of the parliament. And then maybe on the functioning here, I could also say that as I said in the beginning here, Kyrgyzstan's parliament has really played a dynamic role here in the country's political development, but it has also been unstable. I would say the role it has played. In some period, it has very much been at the center of the political struggle, and also provided some I would say check and balances on presidential authority. While in other periods, it has served as a more compliant and a little bit more like a rubber stamp body, supporting the presidents irrespective of, and such periods existed basically during Akayev's time, Bakiyev, Atambayev, Jembekov also for some periods. So, and another part of this, how it has functioned, I would say that over time, it is very clear when you look from tracing this back to the 90s and how they really improvised here to establish this and to transform essentially a Soviet body here into an independent parliament. So you can really see when you look back in this 30-year-long period here that the technical and procedural and organizational framework for parliamentary work in Kyrgyzstan has steadily improved all the time here. But at the same time, I would say that the corps of deputies in a way here of parliamentarians have become less competent. If you look back to this, for example, this legendary parliament, as it is still called, from the early 1990s, there you see, of course, that really represented the political, economic, and intellectual elite there of Kyrgyzstan at that particular period of time. Yeah. While these last parliamentary convocations have very much been, as I mentioned, defined by these financial resources, and as long as you have, those resources, there are basically no limits, I would say, regarding what kind of people that can gain political representation. It becomes a quite lack of boundaries in a way. So I would say that the level of competence and the human capital here of the parliament has deteriorated. And you can also see maybe like the quality of legislation has not really improved, I think, and they also see increasing costs in terms of they keep a lot of assistants and other things around themselves, and so the cost for each legislation have increased also. Final thing maybe to say, I would say maybe to open up. I mean, Kyrgyzstan's this parliamentary system still represented very much an attempt at the time here to open up the political system and also establish a more democratic system. But one takeaway, and this I have always, sometimes I think maybe it's difficult to only focus on it, but I would still say that the experience here underlines the difficulties or complexity here of democratization in states suffering with these ineffective state institutions. including high levels of corruptions and low levels of economic development. And in such contexts, of course, when you increase political competition here, it doesn't lead by automatically to improved governance here in terms of delivering state services and sustainable economic development. So what I want to say here is that if you put Kyrgyzstan a little bit in a broader global outlook also, I mean, this is not a unique problem for Kyrgyzstan, and look ahead also on the prospects for democracy here to really take hold in Kyrgyzstan. I would emphasize this aspect of governance as a key here. I mean, the good or at least decent governance here, as opposed to these predatory governance that you have seen with some varying degrees in Kyrgyzstan. I think that is necessary if as a foundation for political competition to really be meaningful and for democratization to be sustainable here. And of course, in this sense, comes up, of course, the issue of political leadership, I think is really matters. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you. I look forward also to hear Erica's remarks.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Johan. Erica, your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to comment on Johan's excellent work, really excellent work. It's one of the most comprehensive, if not the most comprehensive account of what happened with the parliamentary experiment in Kyrgyzstan or the history of parliamentarism in Kyrgyzstan since the early 1990s up until today. And really detailed account, really thoughtful account, I would say also very balanced, based in deep research and deep understanding of the system and political system and society in Kyrgyzstan. I especially appreciated Johan's careful explanation of this dilemma in Kyrgyzstan. Why did political competition, this really dynamic political competition, never resulted in stronger institutions? Because that's what we expect usually, that greater political participation and competition, and especially competitive elections, unpredictable, competitive, frequent elections would eventually lead to more accountability, checks and balances emerging, and stronger institutions. That obviously did not happen in Kyrgyzstan. Just the opposite, in fact, took place. That institutions became even more hollow and more corrupt in that sense. And Johan does a fantastic job explaining it on a systemic level, based on the structure of the political system. So what kind of constitutions were in place at different times of Kyrgyzstan's history, but also tracing trajectories of individual actors, how they found their way to prevail within the system, including, for instance, Japarov or Tashiyev, the current leaders of Kyrgyzstan, how they were able to manipulate the system and then rise to the top of power. And also how Johan carefully observed also the typical profile of an MP in Kyrgyzstan. It's usually a middle-aged Kyrgyz man with roots in strong business interests, who prevails in parliamentary competitions, parliamentary elections. I think Johan also explained how competitive elections, so more competitive elections, is not really the, it doesn't equal more representation, more representative parliament. And it's just enriches our understanding of how the processes between elections, what takes between elections, is as important as what happens during elections. Because Kyrgyzstan did have some really amazing elections, especially in fall of 2010, when 5 political parties were represented in the parliament, and they basically I think at that point they did represent the strongest political powers in Kyrgyzstan, of course, meaning that ethnic minorities were excluded, and women were excluded for the most part as well. I think Johan also shows how even though sometimes political debate became more sophisticated in Kyrgyzstan, the ways how political parties or members within political parties also found more ways, right? More ways to skirt the system to make sure their individual interests are prevail over their political party interests or just institutional interests in the parliament. And I kept and by the way, he also without retelling Johan's main arguments, Johan really explains us why 2020 happened. Why did the system, this whole experiment with parliamentarism that existed there for about a decade, why did it spectacularly collapsed in 2020 following parliamentary elections in October 2020, and how Japarov then freed himself from jail and self-appointed himself to be the president. And my question is, and I think you explain it again and again in the parliament, I mean, in the report, but I feel like you need to highlight it even more in your analysis of what happened in Kyrgyzstan, or the development of parliamentarism in Kyrgyzstan. Is so as someone from Kyrgyzstan, whenever I travel to Bishkek, I'm always faced with this dilemma, with this really misunderstanding, this schizophrenic picture of how the society is so strong, the society is so politicized, civil society is robust and sophisticated. The discussions about what Kyrgyzstan needs, what kind of mistakes were made in the last decade or two, who is corrupt, who is not corrupt, who has some principles, who doesn't have principles. So all these discussions are always ongoing. And there are lots of civic initiatives in how to uncover corruption schemes, how to make sure that more people participate in the political system. And yet with such sophisticated society, we have an incredibly primitive political system, well, primitive may be really too much of a judgment, but really corrupt political system that does not represent this sophisticated society. So basically, how did this happen in Kyrgyzstan? Why such dynamic, politicized, incredibly politicized society is not represented? What's the disconnect? And if I may, I think you need to pay more attention, and we all need to pay more attention on the specific institutions that are the legacy of the Soviet regime, and specifically the judicial system. How all former Soviet countries inherited a judicial system that serves the political regime, and a lot of the problems stem from this really dependent, politically loyal institution that on the one hand rubber stamps or quickly changes loyalty to whoever rises to power to support that incumbent, and on the other hand also does not is very corrupt and does not really do due diligence in investigating corruption, and especially top level corruption. And that seems like among all other institutions, be that the Central Elections Commission, the Parliament, whatever other ministries, this seems like the most problematic part of institutions in Kyrgyzstan, and also in other countries. And I think this is a warning sign for all of us. If we see greater democratization in other countries in Central Asia, let's say in Kazakhstan or in Uzbekistan in the coming years or decades, I don't know how much it's going to take, greater political competition, will the judicial system and what other institutions will prevent this competition from taking genuine, from becoming genuine democratic tradition or system within those countries as well. So yeah, so these are my comments. I really appreciate, this is this is a fantastic report, and a lot of Johan's interpretations and analysis is rooted in his previous work, especially his amazing book on Kyrgyzstan, state as an investment market in Kyrgyzstan, which explained a lot of the problems with corruption in Kyrgyzstan and showed how corruption works within a state in Kyrgyzstan. And I think it is a good explanation, or a good explanation, a good manual for what not to do in other countries as they also try to experiment with more representative political systems. So Johan does a great job explaining and dissecting everything, what happened in Kyrgyzstan, highlighting successes, but also explaining spectacular failures as well in Kyrgyzstan. So yeah, and if you can answer my question, I'd be really delighted to hear why the disconnect, what happens, why is it like that in Kyrgyzstan? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erica. Johan, feel free to answer that, but also react to any other points that Erica raised. In the meantime, I'd urge our relatively limited audience today to get very involved in our discussion. Otherwise, I will be compelled to do so with unknown consequences.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you for those words, Erica, and those questions that you raised there, and then these two. Actually, especially this with civil society, and which is, as you say, strong and robust, and there's also generational change coming now. So, but I have thought about this quite a lot recent, also regarding this, what happened in tragic events in Kazakhstan in relation to that. Maybe you could help me write an article about this, something shorter, because I don't know really how to connect it. But I totally agree with this. There's some kind of disconnect here between these societies that are changing, not just in Kyrgyzstan, I think, but Kyrgyzstan is a very good example. Changing very quickly. There are, of course, you have, you know, strong civil society, this more liberal and democratic oriented forces, but you also have these more nationalistic or other forces also. But it's changing fast, and it's a very dynamic societies, and I think we see that also. So there is some kind of disconnect here between these, how to say, stagnated post-Soviet political systems that they still are, you know, these top-down constructs, you know, around Soviet-trained elite, who still based on this rather authoritarian model with corruption quite a lot. But these, you see now after 30 years, these countries have really, the societies here are developing, they are not the same. I mean, look at Central Asia, I think in general, if you take all 5 countries, 70% of the population, I think, is below, on average, 40. That means that, you know, those are 40 today, they were 10 years old when the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, these countries, they are becoming themselves, you know, in some ways, yeah, but these systems are still there. So, but I think you see all this. Just look at Ukraine today, for instance, where I think many people who tend to focus just on these, you know, great power politics or whatever it is now, you measure how much military capability they have, yeah, or even believe this, maybe that Putin could have this you know, easy success in some ways. But then, you know, you haven't looked at what has happened in a, now I'm not an expert on Ukraine, but you see a country here which has developed for 30 years. They have been through 2 revolutions, been formed also in a war now for 8 years, and also this tremendous, you know, also the here how they, not just the state institutions, on that level, and the strong, you know, coherence of the military and other things that you see, but also down to this type of community levels or in different parts of cities, and when people self-organize and do all this, quite amazing to watch. Yeah. So I think this type of this disconnect here between state and society, I think that's something to, and I can only see that these type of processes will continue. But you also look in countries like Kazakhstan, then when you hear this, even Tokayev talking about you know, having this listening state, and then also these type of, they know there is something there, but then of course it's difficult to do it in another way, and that than the way they are used to in this type of top-down models. Yeah, but it's increasingly difficult, I think, to control these societies in this way. So I expect also to see, and Kyrgyzstan has really been in the forefront in this sense of this, you know, finding this also connect with the political level in which means it's one step back maybe and one step forward sometimes, but I think, yeah, I've been thinking about this, so maybe I will show it to you, so maybe you can give me some advice there how to write about this. And then with this judicial system, I think, yeah, absolutely, I totally agree. I think that's probably with this Soviet legacy, probably the hardest to actually, remarkably how easy, without no effort really, they just change over a day when there's a new leader in town. Yeah, and probably I would say that much of all these other reforms are very difficult, and especially with corruption, of course, if this level is not addressed. And maybe it's also a question of time here, but yeah, extremely good points. Thank you.
Thank you. While our audience ponder their reactions, I want to go back to this question that came up in both of your comments, I think, which is, I guess, could be translated as the resistance to reform or to resistance to sustainable democratization that we can see really all across the former Soviet space. For a while, we put our faith in, or were rather encouraged by, peaceful revolts. I personally think there was a tendency to misread those peaceful revolts that we call the color revolutions. They were seen as something about democratization. It seems to me they may have been more about a reaction to bad management and corruption, rather than more specifically how democratic or authoritarian the countries are. Please disagree with me if I'm wrong. In any case, we can see that they did not produce any sustainable democratization anywhere. In Kyrgyzstan, we had several revolutions. In Ukraine, we had 2. Georgia, so far, still only 1, but with visible regression in all areas. Then you have countries that have tried a more evolutionary effort of reform. They haven't gotten very far, but if you see at least the rhetoric from leaders in both, of course, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and to some extent Azerbaijan, you see that there is this realization we need to, at least part of the government leadership realizes we really need to reform the system. Maybe it is because they realize that that's the only way they might stay in power. Maybe they really think it's good for the country. I don't know. But even then, even when you seem to have top level people who really want to implement reforms, it just doesn't seem to happen because forces at other levels of the state seem to be able to continue to stop it, even 30 years after the Soviet Union. Is there something specific, do you think, with, I mean, not Kyrgyzstan, but the post-Soviet countries in terms of how resistant to sustainable democratization they are? And why is that? And does Kyrgyzstan help us see any ways out of this conundrum? I guess I'll put it like that. Either of you, who would like to start this easy question? Erica, perhaps you have
Okay. I can start. It's a very interesting question. I firmly believe, looking at Kazakhstan, I firmly believe that all countries in the former Soviet system will have this kind of uprisings. It's a matter of time, because the Soviet system was built to serve the incumbents and not the people. And at some point, as societies become more sophisticated, more aware of their rights, accumulating some capital, with some middle class emerging, they will demand for better representation in the system. And those grievances will be in the shape of protests, usually because there are just no venues for state-society dialogue, because the systems are not representative of the population. And it happened in Kazakhstan. The grievances are not gone. It will, the protest will resurface at some point again. I'm completely convinced in this, and it will happen at some point. Protests will happen in Uzbekistan at some point. We have to expect. I think it's naive to think that incumbents, by promising reforms, will then also actually deliver them. The societies will understand that all these promises of reform are, in fact, what you, Svante, said, that it's probably to retain power as opposed to really genuinely giving up power and making systems more representative, opening political dialogue, making systems more unpredictable, competition more unpredictable. And again, I'm not advocating for the Kyrgyzstan path by no means. Kyrgyzstan is just the other extreme of how incredibly unpredictable and unstable the system became. But I also want to say that what is it about the post-Soviet countries? And I think, again, going back to institutions, specifically to judicial system and to security institutions, I think this is a specific Soviet legacy that we don't see, let's say, in post-colonial regions of former British Empire. So the Soviet colonial legacy was much more devastating for democratic institutions than, let's say, British colonial experiment that led to stronger judicial systems. We see that in India, in South Africa, that where you have where political system might be corrupt, but still we have judicial institutions that deliver. And I think when it comes to Central Asia specifically, what is going on in Central Asia specifically that might not be applicable to other parts of the former Soviet space. I'd like to raise some of the points that are currently made by researchers of the Soviet regime, the Soviet rule in Central Asia, specifically Botakos Kasimbekova, Aminat Chokobayeva, and other researchers who point at how the Soviet system just completely erased the cultural and public memory. It was completely erased elite circles in the Soviet in Soviet Central Asia, and Central Asian countries were created from the perspective. And again, I'm not going to go too much into this post-colonial discourse, but they were created from the point of view of what was needed for Moscow to rule the region. And Central Asian countries still grapple with this legacy of completely of trying to understand what was there before the Soviet regime and who are we anyways, what kind of ideals we have, because the cultural and elite memory has been erased. We had 100 years of no history, no production of critical discourse about Central Asian identity. So now we're coming to this period of trying to understand what is it that we want aside from the Soviet regime? Who are we anyways? What kind of political ideals we share? This is another conversation entirely, but I would want to just repeat what Kasimbekova, for instance, says, that the Soviet legacy in Central Asia was beyond just colonialism. It was a complete erasure of culture, of political identity, of cultural identities in Central Asia. And we just need to keep that in mind when we talk about political developments today. I don't know if this is the answer you expected.
No, this is actually very useful. I'll come back to that in a moment, but let's see what Johan
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I also found this extremely fascinating there in the end there about this post-colonial, or actually see, that's an interesting aspect. I mean, in the beginning, all of these countries were probably for a couple of decades at least, quite superficially studied through this, you know, post-communist paradigm or transition studies and things like that. This is extremely interesting. Yeah, maybe I agree with many of these things here about that you mentioned about Kazakhstan and the whole thing. Other countries also will have to go through things like that. It will happen. I think so as well. And also maybe if I change the perspective a little bit also on Kyrgyzstan's last revolt or revolution there in October 2020. Of course, it didn't take, I still think there are some lessons here also. While it didn't take the country in a more democratic direction, I would say that it still brought in a new kind of political leadership. This populist nationalist President Japarov, he appeals quite a lot to this, in particular to traditional and nationalist-oriented segments of the population who are trying to find their place, of course, also, particularly then among youth and also rural population. And you can see also he, for instance, I think there was some, I don't remember who wrote something really interesting about this, how he reached out to his followers here. Largely by bypassing these traditional media outlets and things like that, relying instead on more direct, you know, personal communication, social media, and this type of unfiltered posts, yeah, further help to establish him as some kind of more authentic, you know, representative here of the people. I think, and also this Oksana Ismailbekova, she has wrote a beautiful piece on this. I was like the native son here. And also in that sense, distinguishing him very much from this type of very distant type of Soviet type of style of the formal political leaderships, I would say. And also when you talked about this in a broader sense here about Kazakhstan, and you mentioned Uzbekistan, and I think also you can see that they are starting to feel in a way also that they need to have a more direct, some kind of new relationship, even if they are, of course, hesitant to let loose of control and all that. Yeah. But if I remember correctly, one of the first initiatives here of Mirziyoyev when he was coming to power was to establish this kind of a direct hotline here to give citizens a direct communication channel to him. Yeah. And might not sound like the biggest deal, but it's still something there. And you see also in other initiatives he's doing it. So I totally agree. I think there is something here. But then exactly how unique this post-Soviet, I thought this, yeah, maybe I'll stop there and I just emphasize again that I thought this post-colonial aspect was interesting to actually understand the level here of maybe challenge here for Central Asia. Thanks.
I think both of you touched on that point, which is that the system that they started off with was not comparable to other parts in the world. But I think the point you made, Erica, that this is not a post-Soviet problem necessarily. This is a particular problem to Central Asian states. In a way, you could say that you had a multi-tiered starting point. You know, the countries in Central Eastern Europe had a head start because they've not only had prior statehood, they also had prior, you know, somewhat democratic experiments. States in the South Caucasus, well, they had a little bit of statehood. At least they had 2 years of statehood, even if it was bloody, after the First World War, and the Central Asian states really didn't. Definitely not in the borders or with the names with which they were created in the Soviet period. I think that's absolutely key. Thank you for bringing it up. But the other point, I think, which doesn't contradict that, which might complement it, is the relationships or the political economy, if you will, the relationships between politics and economics, which is also very specific because of the Soviet heritage and the fact that, you know, the assets, especially in countries that don't have a lot of assets, control over assets were basically taken over by people in positions of state authority. And it seems even in countries where you have revolutionary change of government, it doesn't seem to be that the ownership conditions in the state actually become, should we say, institutionalized, or if you want to go back into political science, the roving bandits becoming stationary bandits, but you just have it handed over from one bandit to another. So as assets get expropriated and get taken over by somebody else, because the logic still seems to be that if you want to have political power, you have to have the biggest patronage pyramid of anybody around. The bigger your patronage pyramid, the greater your political influence. And if you are a person who comes to power, sometimes because you don't have a patronage system of your own, well, you better acquire one very fast, because otherwise you're going to be out of power. And that seems to work both in countries that have a parliamentary system of government and a presidential system of government. It doesn't really seem to change the nature of the relationships of politics and economics. Is that something you would agree with, or would you perhaps put it differently? Erica, go.
Okay, I'll go very quickly. Just a quick note on the colonial system. There were governance systems in Central Asia prior to Soviet regime. They didn't look like European countries, but there were definitely governance systems there that were, again, completely destroyed. On the patronage system, I think Kyrgyzstan being so corrupt, the cost of corruption is still higher. The political cost of corruption is still higher than, let's say, in places like Tajikistan. Corruption is really spread out, and politicians are actually trying to conceal it. They don't like media to cover them, because mass media, and especially investigative journalists, they do uncover corruption from time to time, and that sends ripple effects across the society. In Tajikistan, the costs of corruptions are really low because of lack of independent media, civil society, political competition. So there we see the higher levels, basically the presidential family engaged in criminal activities. In organized crime. Lots of reports suggest that. This is not just my analysis. So that kind of level of corruption, we don't see that. There are no talks of the presidential family engaged in cover-up of drug trafficking, for instance. So the cost of corruption is still higher in Kyrgyzstan than in Tajikistan. It is still a corrupt place. But at least there is an effort to cover up corruption a little better than in countries with no freedom of speech and very little civil society.
Thank you, Johan.
Yes, thank you. When it comes to Kyrgyzstan, I'm always one thing is, I remember when during Bakiyev times, it was very difficult to actually, because not so much was reported in media and all that, and it was quite tightly controlled. So it was really difficult to get a hold of the extent of it. But then now when media, that's also been a bit of paradox here with the parliamentary system, when different politicians, they had their different media also to some extent, or influence over. So there were also competition here about reporting and all that. So it became a lot of reporting, which was a good thing on principle, of course, but also made maybe the public believe that it's just getting worse and worse. So it's this type of dilemmas in a way between these more competitive systems that might also have some, I remember you, Erica, you wrote a really good piece there on after a couple of years of this parliamentary system, where it actually, and that probably lasted all the way through, in a way that it moved politics into this elite politics, into more organized, inside the parliament, instead of just having these street protests and everything. But it still didn't really manage to catch on to the political representation and all that. But that function was still there, at least. But then now you can see, of course, that there's something here about this, media and civil society also. It's not risk-free to be involved in this type of, definitely not in Kyrgyzstan, this because there are investigations there all the time. They're coming more and more, and people, they react to this also. So in that sense, I would say that I'm a bit more optimistic nowadays regarding this because when I wrote, for instance, this book on the corrupt system, it was very much about the state. And some people have nowadays asked me when I taught about this for some students here in Sweden, what about the people in this country? And that's what I'm thinking a little bit more now when I feel and see this, how it has developed, that I'm much more optimistic in some sense that eventually this type of society will change this type of state, corrupt state system that I really saw as like an iron. This is very difficult to put to, but I of course it will take time, but there is something going on there in society, and I don't think that this type of political level state can be disconnected, as Erika said, from this society for that long. Yeah, and I still think that maybe even this rise of Japarov could be in a way some part of this also when you look back on it later on, maybe. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from our audience. Arzu Sheranova asks if you could elaborate more about the parliamentarism experiment and the external aspect, if geographical proximity to Russia played some role in how this evolved. I guess I remember Mr. Medvedev at some point talking about Kyrgyzstan as an parliamentarism as a fool's errand or something to that effect. I guess we could bring in China as well. Trying to do what Kyrgyzstan tried to do in this geopolitical environment. What's the effect? Has it gotten harder? And what do you say about that? Maybe Johan, this time you start.
Sure. This is a good question. I've actually thought about it myself a bit, and I remember at that time, maybe 7-8 years ago, this was also something brought up actually by the politicians. It was hard to know exactly how serious they were always about this, but they always mentioned this, that, you know, they were quite skillful when maybe Kyrgyzstan didn't really manage to put that out more on for the international community, and to some extent maybe there was a leadership problem also. But when you talk to some of these, they could often paint this picture of, you know, this compact authoritarian bloc and this small Kyrgyzstan in between. And can we survive? They asked rhetorically often. Yeah, it's not sure. And so I've also thought about this aspect of these international factors. And of course, and they were open about this, of course, with the Central Asian neighbors, but especially then, of course, Russia, as was correctly mentioned here, Medvedev's, that this would be a complete disaster and things like that. And you had China, of course. It's not a good environment. That's for sure makes it very difficult. So that factor, in a better environment, of course, but you cannot isolate like that. But I think they would have been much better, you know, outlook for this to work. But I still think that how it still played out, this played a role, I think, this international environment, the external environment, but also I think there were these internal processes, I think, that still show that this wasn't really ready in a way, and it didn't manage to serve the purposes that maybe we had hoped, and for really to provide effective governance for the people here, and that's the thing here. I mean, it's also this aspect of, I mean, more competitive democratic system has also a value in itself to some extent. Yeah, that, you know, people, even if there are some problems with how it's run and it's very ineffective, maybe you can even say that probably now one thing with the Japarov government is probably that is what I've understood, that probably more effective in quick decision making and all these type of things, and you know. And you can also say that, I would say, during Bakiyev's time, actually, that for a while there, after a while there, he improved some state functions here. I mean, collected more taxes and all these things. The problem was, of course, that in that case, it was coupled with very brutal and totally predatory rule. Yeah, but yeah, there are this, you know, difficult to say, because there might also be And Kyrgyzstan has shown again and again that, you know, this type of, when the system is completely unfair or it's very narrow for a few people and doesn't deliver, then there is a demand quickly for some changes and things like that. So I think this type of dilemma here between, you know, governance and, you know, more openness, that is something difficult to address, I think.
Please, Erica.
Oh, I think it's very hard to say whether Russia or China have a direct influence. I do think that we need to pay more attention to domestic processes because yeah, I think they matter more. And sometimes it's very convenient to explain, oh, here's China, here's Russia, but then we can explain it either way. If Kyrgyzstan were just a complete autocracy, we would say, oh, it's just because of Russia, China. But you know, it's very hard to blame those large countries for what's going on in Kyrgyzstan. And I think I completely share optimism, Johan's optimism about Kyrgyzstan. I think, so sometimes I ask my students, would you rather live in a country where you can speak freely, express your opinion, be political, but then face political uncertainty in the system and see regime changes here and there every few years? Or would you prefer to have so-called economic stability with lack of freedoms? And some students choose Kazakhstan model, some students choose Kyrgyzstan model, but then January happens in Kazakhstan and we see that political stability is actually stagnation, and it can implode in a very unpredictable way as well. So it's I think it is I think a dynamic political development of Kyrgyzstan will eventually lead to a fairer political system in general, and a more, I guess, dignified citizenship than having a top-down rule and a facade of reforms. That's all I need to say today.
Thank you. We're slowly running out of time. I wanted to continue our discussion on the present day. Now, President Japarov, of course, has been very vocal about the problem of corruption in the country, perhaps more so. I mean, not that predecessor didn't mention it, but I think he seems to be more vocal about it. Now, the question that very much comes up again here, just as we were talking about other countries in the region, is rhetoric versus reality. Does this government in Kyrgyzstan seem motivated to really change something? Or are we seeing more of the same, so to speak? Erica, why don't you go first? Oh,
no, of course, more of the same. The claims that he's fighting corruption are very similar to what we hear from other populists across the world, from Orban, Bolsonaro, Trump, Duterte. They're all fighting some kind of evil corruption. But in fact, it's just populist politics, and corruption can only be fought with strong institutions, with checks and balances, with deep reform, again, of the judicial system, law enforcement, and so on. And that we don't see happen across former Soviet space. Leaders, they know how to use and how to manipulate security structures to serve them, and that's what Japarov is doing as well with Tasheyev.
Johan?
I'm more skeptical every year about, you know, anti-corruption fight, this type of direct programs and things like that. In this type of systems, when still, you know, they are based on this very, you know, corrupt structures, I think it's very difficult. I think it's more important actually to try to make some other type of reforms, not focus so much on this very politicized, always in this type of systems, focus on corruption. And go about it more, maybe more indirectly with reforms and things like that, if there's the political will to do something about it. You can see with Japarov maybe that he sent out maybe some signals, maybe also coupled to this, that he, as I mentioned, he tried to, you know, he's people's representative now, you know, inside this, at least it was like that in the beginning there in the state institutions, and now you have to clean up here the corrupt things. But of course, then you see quite quickly that it's with this type of system, it's very selective, and also it's very total lack of transparency, or actually what's happening to all this. He had some of these ideas of economic amnesties and things like that, but where are these money going, and things like that. So I'm more and more skeptical about this. The Georgians maybe did it to some extent earlier and all that, but that maybe came back to to some extent also. So I'm not sure about this very aggressive focus on just on anti-corruption. I think it's very difficult to, I don't know if the gains are that huge, you know, when the system works as they do, you know, when this political and economic union and how that really shaped the whole structures here. I think, yeah. So it's a difficult question.
You mentioned Georgia. It's quite interesting that although there was undeniably a change in Georgia in terms of the petty corruption, definitely in the Saakashvili era, one of the weak areas of Georgian reform was the judicial sector, the courts, and so forth. And I think that what happened in Georgia later on, the return of corruption, which you see very clearly in various international indexes, maybe a testimony to the fact that it was not done through the building of institutions primarily, but in type of this more punitive type of corruption, which anti-corruption, which might work for a while in selected sectors, but not so long. I think we've come to our last question. This is from our old friend and collaborator, sometime collaborator Anthony Boyer, who asks about Kyrgyzstan's potential for greater cooperation with Western NGOs, or will this happen, or will they be more adherent to Russia's hostile stance on Western so-called intervention? I guess I could add to that question, maybe you could treat them together. The corollary to the first audience question on Russia is the lack of Western support after 2010. It seems to me that if you look at the successful cases of consolidated democratization, that usually happened with a certain level of outside support. I haven't crunched any numbers, but it seems to me that Kyrgyzstan couldn't have gotten a percentage point even of what some countries in Central and Eastern Europe got in the 1990s when they embarked on a similar endeavor. Would you see this be a part of the lack of success, for example, in the parliamentary system? And do you see any greater re-engagement happening in relation to Anthony's question? Erica, if you go first, we'll let Johan have the last word.
Sounds great. So yeah, good question, Anthony. I think, so yes, all of the above. I think it's some support, but also not enough support, but also how in the 1990s, the focus was mostly on NGOs and NGOization and kind of bringing Western liberal agenda into NGOs across the world, across the global South, and making sure that the civil society forms around those ideals. And I think right now what we see in Kyrgyzstan is civil society is much more than just NGOs. There's so many activist communities, collectives, individual activists who, or civil society among entrepreneurs, socially conscious entrepreneurs, for instance, who don't fit the standard understanding of what civil society is very often from a Western perspective or from a USAID perspective. But nevertheless, they do they perform the functions of civil society. There are also, of course, elements of uncivil society, of those nationalistic, misogynist groups, promoting ultra-conservative values, but that also sort of a sign of a democratic society in a way that you will have those radical elements as well. And I think just like anywhere in the world, it is important for the Western community to refocus on the concept of society and see it beyond groups that are registered and have a logo to groups that are loosely organized, but they have different ways of influencing political life in the country. And there are many of those as well across Kyrgyzstan, not just in large cities, but also in smaller villages. And they resurface during you can see more of their activity during political crises, and then less maybe when life is more stable in the country.
Johan, you are you got the first word. Now you get the last word.
I pick up on this. I think this is very interesting, and I totally agree. Maybe it's time to really rethink or reimagine civil society in a way here, also by looking at what's the demand here, or what, and also this. I mean, those who started NGOs, maybe that's like 20, 25 years ago. That's maybe not that something that those people that are 20 years old now are thinking about and are politically active. They are expressing themselves in completely different ways. And we also see in these demonstrations that have been, or protests against anti-corruption, for instance, also that it's quite novel ways that they are organizing and things to that. So I think maybe listening here to much more to the situation on the ground here in Kyrgyzstan, and try to capture this type of initiatives and the dynamics that exist here among a very young society. So I think that's probably would be much more interesting than trying to replicate this just this NGO approach. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. On the NGO approach, I suggest you also consult the Central Asia-Caucasus Analyst website, where we have a feature article recently by Fabienne Bossuit, who talks about how the West has been very much focused on supporting forces that look like the Western donors want them to look, rather than the way indigenous forces in Central Asian states may be developing, especially now. Like I hear you saying, this isn't the 1990s anymore. We are going to adjourn this meeting, but I would like to call your attention to future events. We don't have any specific date planned, but we will be coming out with that shortly, focusing both on the implications for Central Asia and the Caucasus of the Russian war in Ukraine, as well as at some point during the spring, turn our attention to the Caucasus after the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan a year and a half ago. Stay tuned. Thank you for our audience for participating, and thank you both Erica and Johan for your very interesting observations. I look forward to continuing them at some later time.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Svante. Good to see you.